So it's week 2 of server-side scripting. It's the second part of class. First part of class, we were planning out, we were deciding what did we want to build, and the consensus was, well, we're going to build an everything store. So together, we kind of put together our database. So I've sketched out an entity relationship diagram. These are the 6 main tables. We may need to modify them a little bit, but I think in terms of being able to create a store with products, let users shop, check out, make an order, these are the basics of what we need. So I've put some of the other tables that we may add in a little bit later. I've kind of just put them down at the bottom and haven't really defined those. But I sort of fleshed out, I think, the basic fields we'll need and what those relationships are going to look like. So we're going to build most of these tables. The one table that we actually won't manually build and we'll see later is we don't actually have to manually build a users table. And the reason for this is ASP.NET already has infrastructure around user authentication. So that's actually going to give us a pre-built users table. There's also a pre-built table for roles, so we can manage different types of users. For example, customers versus administrators who will have different permissions in the applications. Obviously, we don't want customers to be able to go in and manage the product category. Sure, I'm going to set the price of this to 1 cent so then I could buy it. So I've taken a kind of a PNG copy of this and put this up now on Blackboard. So you can find the ERD right here in Tools and Resources. Okay, so we'll refer to this diagram. And again, we may do some work around these tables a little later in the course, but these are the basics so that we can set up our store. So this is what it's going to look like. So we won't set the database up today. What I will do is I'll create an SQL script, which will generate these tables for you guys, and I'll put it up on Blackboard sometime by next week's class, so we can actually get the database created next week. And I'll talk a little bit about the software you're going to need in order to do that. We'll talk about that before the end of class today. Okay, and that'll give you a week to go home and install that and have that running so that next week we can actually create a local database. Okay, so in class, I'm going to work with a local database just because it's faster. I'll also show you in the next few weeks how we can create and deploy a database on Azure. Again, we don't want to do that too soon because it uses up your Azure credits. So the longer we can kind of put that off, the more space and resources you'll have to deploy stuff for your assignments on Azure. So we'll kind of come to that over the next few weeks. So I will set this up and have that script, and then this is kind of what we're working towards. And this is the application we'll actually be building out. So what we want to do now is we want to set up a project that we're going to work on. So last week, we just kind of created a basic solution. We're not going to use that one, but the solution we're going to set up today, this is basically what we're going to work with every class from now on. Okay, so if you're not here, make sure you watch the YouTube video and get caught up. So when you come to class the following week, your everything store is kind of in the same position with everybody else's. So I'm going to create the project now. So I'm going to open up Visual Studio. One thing I'm just going to mention, I had a chat with one student before the class, and we were talking about, you know, student was asking, what do I need to do to be successful in class? Now I found there's two kind of, most of the time in class, we're sort of going to be building this application together. Okay, so I'm going to be coding stuff, asking you guys for suggestions and feedback, explaining what we're doing. And for most people, kind of trying to code along with me is going to be a good approach, right? So if you get an error, you can stop, ask a question, etc. Okay, and that kind of makes the best use of our time. I realize that doesn't work for everybody. For some people, the idea of listening to the explanation, watching the code, trying to do it is too much, too many tasks to do all at once. If that's the case, that's fine. Come to class, pay attention, follow along to what's going on, ask questions, and then go home, watch the screencast at your own pace, and do the work on the everything store at home, and then come back next week's class. So whatever will work for you, I would recommend. Okay, so let's create a new project. We're going to create a new project. Now, I did have a couple of people in their lab one who did lab one but didn't get full marks because they picked this option instead of this one. So we're going to be working with the .NET framework. We're not working with .NET Core. We will during the last couple lessons of class when we build an API, but our everything store is not using the core engine. Okay. So I'm going to pick .NET framework. Save by default, I think your project gets saved to My Documents, Visual Studio 2017 projects. You can save it there. If you have a separate folder already created for the course, you can put it in there. Save the project wherever you want. I already have a COMP2084 folder, so I'm going to create my project in here. And then give your solution a name. Don't use spaces, and I recommend you don't use hyphens. If you want to separate the words, either use underscores, or you'll notice the Microsoft naming convention is to use Pascal case. What is Pascal case? When you've got multiple words, different from camel case, which is what you're used to using with Java. This is camel case. What would Pascal case look like? Well, you got it. So Pascal case is the default in the Microsoft world. In fact, you'll notice in our controllers, if we create methods in camel case, Visual Studio will actually complain and tell us we haven't followed proper Microsoft.NET naming convention. So this is why in my ERD, I've named the tables, you'll notice, like order details, order data. I've used Pascal case. That's the Microsoft standard. Okay, so I'd recommend you use it as well. So I'm just going to call my project in Pascal case. I'll call it the everything store. You're free to call your project whatever you like. You don't have to use the same solution name. It's going to default to the latest version of .NET Framework. I didn't check this box last week, but I am going to check the create new Git repository, because what this will do is it'll automatically generate the right .gitignore file. A few people have problems with that in their lab, where they had the file, but it had .txt extension or the wrong name. If you check that box, it'll automatically create the gitignore. Okay, if you don't have that option, then you'll have to create the gitignore file manually, like you did in your lab. Okay, all this basically does is initializes Git in the solution folder, and it will automatically create the gitignore file. Okay, so you can just copy it from your lab, or again, the gitignore file is on Blackboard in Tools and Resources. You can just download it. What version of Visual Studio do you have? Professional, Enterprise, or Community? Enterprise. Interesting. Okay, so it's not a version issue. All right. Well, Google, you have it, but you have it up on the top of the window. Okay. Is it somewhere? It's definitely not there for you. All right. Well, let's see. Yes, that's what it is. They've renamed. Yes, it's the option is add to source control. If you see that option, it's the same. They've renamed that at some point. I forgot about that. It used to say, for years, it said add to source control. Okay. So check that off. Okay. So again, we're using the .NET framework, and make sure you're under Visual C#. You're not down here creating a Visual Basic project. Okay. We're using C# and only C#. The .NET framework, make sure there's no spaces, and we're creating a Git repository or adding to source control. And we're going to create a new directory for the solution. So I'll click OK. And there's two options here we want to enable, the same two options we enabled. Actually, I think last week we only did one. We're going to make sure the MVC template is picked. That will pre-build a whole bunch of stuff for us. We're going to add unit tests. So this will add 2 projects to our solution. the web application project with all our MVC code, and a separate project underneath the same umbrella solution for doing unit testing, which we'll get to probably in March. So we'll come back to the unit test project later. We also want to change the authentication to individual user accounts, because if someone is going to manage the store, they'll need an admin account to add, edit, delete products and categories. And to actually create an order, they're going to need to create a customer account. They can shop without an account. We'll let people browse our store and add to cart as an anonymous user. But as soon as they go to checkout, they're going to have to either register or log in so we know who they are. We're going to change this to individual user accounts. And this will let us both store users in our user table in the database. We're also going to later enable OAuth authentication so somebody can sign in and shop using a Google or Microsoft account. We could do Facebook. We probably won't. We'll see. So those are our three options: MVC, unit tests, individual user accounts for authentication. So again, I'm recording this. When you guys do assignment 1, you're going to need to set your project up with all of these exact same options. Because assignment 1 will morph into assignment 2, and we'll need unit tests and authentication for assignment 2. So we'll just set the project up that way from the beginning. So we'll click OK. We'll let Visual Studio chug away and do its thing. And it'll give us, I think we said our project size is going to be about 120 megabytes when this is finished running. So let this go. While that's running, I'm just going to go into my new folder here called the Everything Store. So as it's building, so we've got our packages. Those are all our support libraries. This folder that has the same name as our solution. So this is our web project. This is where the models use controllers. And notice it just created my test project for unit testing. And now it's done. So it automatically gives me the git ignore file because I checked create new git repository. And here's my .sln file. This is basically just an XML document that lists everything in the project. There's no actual code in here. So there's my project. Excuse me, on disk. So it's 130 megs on disk. And if we look in Visual Studio in our Solution Explorer, if for any reason you don't have this window, you can always turn it on through the View menu. It's the very first item. Most of the time, I like to keep this window open because it lets me navigate around the project, open different files easily. So here's our web project. Notice it's bold because it's the main project in the solution. Here's our unit test project, which I'm actually just going to contract. We're not going to use this until like week 9 or week 10. We're not going to worry about the unit testing for a while. So here's our project. And if we look on disk, if I go into my web project, here's our bin folder, right? We talked about this in the quiz. And you'll notice, so there's a whole bunch of dynamic link libraries, a whole bunch of DLLs, Microsoft support libraries. But we don't yet actually have a DLL called the everythingstore.dll. Why don't we have it yet? Right, because our project has never been compiled, so all the existing C# source code files have never been compiled into a DLL. So if we go back to Visual Studio, the first thing I do, if I click on the build menu and build my solution, it will compile our code. At least it will try. If there's no errors, it will compile our code. So it's going to try building, and it says it built 2 projects. Remember, the unit testing is one project. The web application is the second project. They both compiled successfully. And if I go back and look now in my bin folder, here's our everything store DLL. So it's tiny right now. So really small footprint, which is nice. It doesn't use a lot of server space. It will run quickly because that DLL is small. As we add source code, we add models and controllers, that DLL is going to grow. Okay, so our application, we should be able to launch it now. How can we see our application template in the browser? Which menu option do we want? We could click this, but that's actually going to launch our debugger. So then we can't make any changes without first stopping the debugger. So that will work, but there's probably a more efficient way. Yeah, we can start without debugging. So this will launch our local IIS Express server that's built in with Visual Studio, sets it up on a random port, launches it in the browser, but because the debugger is not active, we can make changes without having to stop the server and then restart it. And it is slow because we just compiled. Every time we do our first load after a build or a compile, it's going to be slow because the server is basically caching that DLL, so all the future requests will run more quickly. No, really slow. Shouldn't be this slow. Just make sure everything's okay in Visual Studio. Seems to be. We can close this page if we want, our startup page. And here's what we get. Yep. I am recording. Thank you for the reminder. Yes, I am. So here's what we get out of the box. Can you say that a little louder, Gurleen? What did you call the name of your project? With no spaces? Okay. What, did it build successfully? Okay, I'll have to come and take a look at it. So you get that error when you try to build. How many errors does it show in the output window? Just one or a whole bunch? Okay, I'll have to look at it. So there's something in the project setup or the Visual Studio setup that isn't quite right. Okay, here's your first task. You're going to make 2 changes to your application. Change number 1. Go and replace where it says application name. Change that to say the everything store. Okay. Task number 2. Change this content here. Instead of telling us what ASP.NET is, put in a little description, just a sentence or 2, about what this application is. So you got to look through the directories, think about what we learned last week. You're going to have to modify 2 files. One file has got the content for the navigation bar, and a separate file has got the content that shows up on this page. Take a minute. Application name to the everything store, and rewrite this content for a better description of what this website is. And I'll ask you how you did it in a couple minutes. Berlin, I'll come have a quick look and see. Yeah, because all of these is where this is yellow. Search for it. Install all the search for these names and then install them. What I would do, look through any of these. Search for the name here. Find it on it and install it. It'll take a little while, but that should be okay. All right, so let's address our Navbar first. Where do I need to go if I want to change this? What file? Views? Oh, yep. Views shared. All right. And layout. So what line number do I need to go to? Where do I change that? Yep, so line 20 has got my link to the home page that right now in that action link method it says that the text on the link says application name. This. Everything store. I'm changing code in the view. It's not a .cs file, so I don't need to compile or build. I can just make a change, go back to my browser and refresh it. Right. And it changes automatically, no build required. Okay, so that's one. Where do we go to change the content here. Right, so I go to view, home, and index. So this is just static HTML. So I can just write whatever I want here. So I'll change the heading to say the everything store. I'm going to change this paragraph, take that out. What I'm going to do is just put in a little description of what this site is, and I'm also going to list what technologies we're going to use. And again, you might want to have this because by the end of the semester, we're going to have a pretty big everything store. This might be something you're showing in a co-op interview, right? Here's something I built with ASP.NET, so that homepage can describe how we put this together. You can say whatever you want here. You don't have to. Put in a link. I haven't created the new Git repository yet, so for now I'll just put it there. And eventually, if I publish this to Azure, I can put a link to the production site. I'll maybe take out this learn more button. And I think I'll take out the rest of the content. So I'll just grab that whole block at the bottom. Those three sections, I don't really need them. I'll just get rid of them. So this will be the only thing on the page. So now my page should look like this. So this, at the moment, just links to my GitHub homepage, but eventually at the end of class, I'll create a repository and we'll have this link go straight to that repository. Doesn't really matter what you say. You don't have to copy my text. Just put on something that you think is meaningful if you might want to show this application to somebody else, right? So they get a sense of what it is. Two other small changes we should make. One at the very, very top of our browser and one at the bottom of this page. What else do you think we should change? Yeah, so let's change the footer. Where would we go to change the footer? Which file? Yeah, so that'll be in layout. And what about at the very top? Yeah, so that'll be on layout. We also have here a header. It says my ASP.NET application. So again, we may want to put the everything store in the header in the layout file as well. So that shows in the browser tab. That helps with search engines, etc. We don't want to just leave it as saying my ASP.NET application. Not very helpful. So in the footer, I'll go back to my layout. So it's got a timestamp for the year. I'll just put in my name and the course code in the footer. So that's line 36. And up on line 6, I'm going to replace my ASP.NET application again with the proper name of the everything store. I'm replacing the browser tabs at the top, and I'm replacing the footer credit at the bottom. So this should be changed now. It now says the everything store So it's got the name of the page and then the everything store. I browse around. It appears on all of them. Maybe later we'll see how we're doing on time. We could even go and grab a free Bootstrap theme, throw it in here so it doesn't just look like the original Visual Studio template. Maybe we'll do that later as well. Okay, so we looked last week. We want to look a little bit more at some of the stuff that's in here. We looked last week at the controllers. So by default, when we set up our project, we got 3 controllers. We have this account controller. This gets created because we changed the authentication from none to individual user accounts. If we pick no authentication like you did in Lab 1, we don't have that controller. In fact, we don't have home or manage. Those both have to do with managing users. So our home controller's got these 3 built-in methods, and we have 3 built-in views, index, about, and contact. And like we had in our quiz question, each one returned, the default return type is an action result. We did talk about this last week as well. Notice each one of these methods returns a view, but it never actually specifies which view it's supposed to return. So how is it that these pages are working? Right? I can click those links in the Navbar on a view. I don't get any errors. How does it know which view to load, considering we haven't told it which view it's supposed to load? Yeah, okay. So by default, our MVC5 behavior is that any method that returns a view will return a view with the exact same name. And if our path is the home, if the method's in the home controller, then the view will live inside of views and a subfolder called home. Right? So our URL is getting interpreted, the controller name, and then the method name inside. And we said last week that was all that routing was set up in this, under app start, this root configuration. So we're setting up, this is the default rules of our URL mapping. Name of the controller, and then the name of the method, and then any optional parameters. So if we want to override that URL pattern, we can, but this is going to be the default. So one thing we didn't talk a lot about, we didn't really talk about what this thing is. So I'm going to open up our, so if we look at our about method, it returns a view called about. That's this view down here. So here we've got a combination of some server-side script. We can see the @ symbol, which Visual Studio color codes for us. And then we've got some static HTML. So what do you suppose is happening here? We didn't really talk about this view bag, but it's something we should become familiar with and we're going to use. So again, let's look at carefully at the controller. Before we return the view, we're setting up a message property, giving it a value of your application description page. And then in the view, we've got @viewbag.message inside of an H3 tag. So when we actually look at this page, it's showing up here and it's larger. So if we inspect it, we should see those H3, that H3 wrapping around it, which we do. Now, ViewBag is an object, unless you worked with the MVC5 before, you've never seen before. So what is it doing here? How does this work? That we're referencing it in the method, we're putting a value into it, and then we're reading or displaying the value back out in the view. So what do you suppose, how is this working? Oops, sorry. So what, Giselle? Very good. So the view bag is basically an empty container that allows us to pass values from a controller method to the view. So we've actually got two values. So the message one we're explicitly setting in the method, but the view bag also, we're also using to set the title. So not only is that title showing here, the view bag's also used in our layout file, because notice the page title also appears in the browser tab at the top of every page, which is good for search engine optimization, that those pages are named. So the view bag is just one way we have, it's kind of a quick and dirty way for us to pass information from the method to the view. And when I say quick and dirty, we use it, but one of the things about the view bag, notice when I put my cursor over it, there's no data type here. The view bag is an untyped object. So we don't typically use it for passing complex objects like we build our store. We're not going to want to pass a list of products in the view bag. We typically use it for passing simple messages or numeric values, like we want to pass a string or an error code or something simple. Stick it in the view bag, populate it in the view bag, in the controller, and then we can render that value in the view. It's not dynamic. It's just an empty, it's kind of an opaque container, like a bag that you can't see the inside of, right? You can throw anything in there, strings, dates, arrays, you can throw anything in and pass it to the view, but there's no knowledge of object type when you do that. Okay, so we'll try this in a minute. So it's one option we have. It's probably not the best option. And I think I've got, so we'll look at some other things. Just go here. I'm not sure if it's in week 2 or week 3. Bear with me for a second. But we have a number of different objects we can use for passing data from a controller to a view. So view bag is the simplest, and we will use it, but again, we're only going to use it to pass really simple things, a single value. Like we want to run a query and we want to count how many items did the query return so we can show that number at the top of the page. We can just calculate that in a method, stick that number in the view bag and render it. Okay? 24 products found, for example. So we've got view bag. We have several other objects. We can use sessions, which we don't use too much because they use a lot of server overhead. We use sessions a little bit. Then we've got view data and view model. So there's a good explanation. Actually, I should throw this version up. So here's the main difference. So view bag is dynamic, but there's no typecasting. Right? So we don't know what's in there, and we can't refer to objects based on specific properties or call specific methods of that data when we use the view bag, just generic. So most of the time when we pass data, we're actually going to use this instead. We're going to use a view model because that allows us to pass strongly typed data to a view. So the view will understand what kind of data we're getting, right? We did this last week. Pull it up for a minute, right? So we said, for example, if we had a URL like this, what type of object is that view going to expect to get at this URL? Yeah, it's going to expect to have a product object, right, which has all the properties of a product, a photo, an image, a photo, a price, a description, a category. So we can stick that stuff in the view bag, but then we don't have access to those properties in the same kind of way. We don't get code hinting, we don't get validation, etc. So most of the time, we're actually going to use more of this structure where we want to pass strongly typed objects to our views. So if at this URL we pass a customer object instead, that view is going to know we've done something wrong. It should expect the product and only a product to come. So we're going to try this a couple of ways. So we made a quick method last week called pricing. Let's make, for today, we're going to make kind of like a fake products page. Later on, we're going to connect this up to our database and our product page will show real products. But for now, we're just going to kind of fake it using in-memory data. So first we'll use the view bag, and then we'll refactor the code and use the view model instead so you can see the differences. So the first thing we're going to do is make a new method. What should our method return? You got it. Actually, all our methods will return an action result. Let's call it products. Visual Studio complains right now because our method doesn't return anything yet. Also just going to come to this for a minute. Notice I named my method, follow the naming convention, and I used the capital P. You don't have to, but if you do this, it tells us there's two problems. It doesn't return anything, and we've violated the naming conventions. Right? It's recommending we use Pascal case and capitalize the P. So I'll accept that hint, and then I'll accept, actually, so we want to return view. So this is going to load a view called products. So now we've got a method that's returning a view. That's step one. We've created the method. What's the action? What's our next step? Sorry? Yeah, even before the view bag. We'll get there, but even before that. We have to rebuild. Why, Lynette, do we have to rebuild? Right, because we've changed the source code in a C# file. So this method is not going to be part of our DLL yet. So now there's two options. We didn't talk about this last week. There's build and rebuild. Most of the time I recommend we do a build. And the reason why is you'll notice the two options underneath, clean and rebuild. Build compiles the latest version of the DLL. Clean deletes any old versions of the DLLs first, because sometimes Visual Studio gets stuck and you need to do a clean. Rebuild does a clean and then a build. So rebuild is a little slower because first it has to delete the DLLs and then regenerate them. So most of the time we want to build. Occasionally our application will get stuck and then we'll need to do a rebuild. So we'll just build the solution. So our products method now gets included in our up-to-date version of the DLL. So it built successfully. Now we can go back to our store and try products. It's going to be slow for a minute because we just did a build. And now we get this. So it calls our method successfully. Why do we get this? What's this telling us? Right, we haven't created any view. It's trying to load some kind of product view. It's looking for all those files. Any one of those files it would accept and try to render, but we haven't created it. So we've built the server end. We haven't built the view part. There's no UI, so there's nothing to load. So the easiest way to do this, I can just right-click my method name, choose Add a View. It automatically will give me the name that matches with a capital P. We'll set it up as empty. Excuse me for now. And we want to use a layout page, right? Because we want the same application skin for this page as for the rest of the site. So we can just browse to views, shared, and pick our layout template. So we'll get the same header, footer, CSS as the other views. So that's one way of doing it. That's probably the simplest way to generate your views. Create the method, and then just right-click and add the view. If you don't have that option, you can just go down here to Views and Home, right-click the Home folder, and just choose Add a View from here. If it doesn't show up, you just pick add a new item. And under web, you can just pick a view page with layout. Name it products, and then browse to your layout template. So if I do it that way, it prompts me what layout file do I want. So here's what we get. So a completely blank page, it'll have our header and footer. It says that it's going to use our layout file. So if I refresh my browser now, this should load, but there's no content on it right now. So if I refresh, there's no recompiling necessary. We didn't modify source code. So we get our header and footer and nothing else. Our URLs are not case sensitive on Windows and IIS. So even though my view is named with a capital P and my method is named with a capital P, in the browser, Windows doesn't care. It will still run all in lowercase, all in caps. So our source code is case sensitive, but the URL paths are not. Now notice we have no page heading here. It just says the everything store. When we're on home, about, and contact, it shows the name of the page here. Yes. If you build it from the method, it will automatically. So in your source code, you probably have this. So if you built it from the method, you have that line of code here. Okay. It doesn't have the layout. So if I put it in. Oh, whoops. Right, it should be in the curly brackets. I can actually put it within this block of code. That should do it for me. Let's see. Right, so now I get products. So yes, if you generate it from the methods more efficient, it will have automatically. Do it manually, I'll manually set the debug. So just like our other pages, we have our page title in an H2 tag. Let's do that. Well, you notice, remember, the view bag is unstructured. So when I hit view bag dot, I get no code hinting. Visual Studio has no idea what's in the view bag. It's kind of a bit of a black box. Could be anything in there. So give me the same kind of page title, page heading. So now our page looks consistent with the others. For some strange reason, there's a period here, and there's, I think they did it like this. Yes, they actually put a period here. Okay, so what we want to do now is we want to look at, we're going to create some fake products, and we're going to put them, we're going to set those fake products up in our method, and then we're going to use the view bag to pass them to the view, and then we want to display the products. So first we'll use the view bag, and then we'll try the view model, which is more structured. So let's go back here. we're going to create products. To the view for display. We can just use a quick for loop here. C# loops we should be familiar, everybody should be familiar with. Exact same syntax as if we were writing Java. Actually, whoops, sorry, hang on. I guess we want to, there's a few different ways we can do this. Think about how I want to do it. Do we want to use a list? Actually, we'll do this. We'll just make a new list of strings. We'll go around and we'll make 10 products called product 1, product 2, product 3, and we'll just create these in a list. And then we'll take that whole list and we'll stick it in the view bag. So for the moment, this is a list of strings, but the view bag doesn't care what it is. It's just some object. So we'll create our list, we'll stick it in the view bag, and then our view should have access to this list. We should be able to display this list using the loop in our view. So we've modified our method we're going to need to build. So everything here is new. So we're going to need to use a loop in our view in order to render these products. So I'll go back to my view, make sure you compile or rebuild. So I'll set up an unordered list. And we can do a simple for each loop. And notice I hit view bag dot, I get no code hinting. The black box, we don't really know what's in there. So we called our object product with a capital P. So let's see what we get if we try and output this list. And notice also if I hit @p, there's no code hinting, no sense of any properties. No idea what p is. If it's a string, it's strongly typed object, list. No sense of it. Let's see if this will render in the browser. We may have to tweak it a little bit. Go back to products. So we'll see what we get when this finishes loading. So it does render our list of strings, but it's a little bit opaque. It's not very clear what kind of data we're getting. And we could put a whole series of dates in there and this would still work. There's no type checking involved when we're using ViewBag. So we're not typically going to want to pass data this way. Again, we might want to pass error messages or instructions or static text or some simple values using ViewBag. That's not generally how we're going to work with our data. Generally, we want to pass strongly typed objects instead. So what we want to set this page up instead of using the ViewBag, we want to set it up to use a view model. So this page knows to expect two things. One, that it expects to get data of type product. And two, we want to set it up so that it knows not just to accept a single product, like this URL, but we want it to accept a list of products. So we can put a declaration at the top of our view that defines those things. We're working with product data and we're working with a list. On this URL, we're going to say we're working with product data, but we're only working with one single product at a time. The details page can only show one product, it can't get a list. So the ViewBag is not really ideal. It's fine for something like a page title, a static value. It's not, we're not working with the database. We just need to pass a simple value from the server to the view. So let's rewrite this. I'm going to comment this out. So this is our old ViewBag, old untyped ViewBag code. So I'll leave it here for reference, but we're not going to use it because this isn't typically the way we would pass data from a controller to a view. So we want to set up a strongly typed object. Now, we don't have any data objects in here. We said last week, once we build our database, Visual Studio gives us a tool to basically generate all of the business classes based on our database tables. So we'll do that in the next week or two, but we don't have that yet. So for now, we're just manually going to create a really simple product class. And then we'll get rid of this. We'll overwrite it in the next week or two. So our business classes, they typically go in models. So we're going to create a really simple class here. It's going to look very similar to a class you would have created in Java. So if we go to models, we'll just right-click it. And let's add a class, which is probably the last little item in your context menu. So again, right-click models, add class. The naming convention for C# classes would be the same as it is in Java, in that our classes are always Pascal case and singular, right? Because it's a model representing one instance of that object. So our class is simply going to be called product CS, singular. If you leave the extension off, that's fine. Visual Studio will automatically give you the .cs extension. It's product. So our controller names are plural. We'll have products controller, but our model names are singular. So we'll add product. So we get this very simple definition, a public class called product. Just to keep it really simple, we'll just define a single property. So public string property called name, which is readable and writable, so we'll write a get and set method. There's probably nothing really new here for you. This should look familiar. So I said, we'll overwrite this with a more fully functional product model in the next week or two. It'll have all the other properties of the product like price. It'll also contain validation rules. So we'll want to make sure, for example, that price is numeric, that it has a value above 0, etc. We can set all those things up in our models. We'll do that in a few weeks. So now I'm going to go back to my controller. And we're still going to make the fake list of products. We don't have a database yet. But now instead of just strings, we're going to create instances of actual products. We're going to have 10 product objects rather than 10 strings. This time, I'm going to make a new list. But this time, we're making a list of products, strongly typed objects rather than strings. Visual Studio is not very happy when I've tried to reference our new object. It says, product cannot be found. Any idea why? And it prompts us, it tells us what the fix is. We can just accept that fix, it will fix our problem. Why does it not recognize that new class that we just built? Okay, well, it's true. We did add a new C# file and we haven't compiled, but it actually doesn't let us compile. We actually have to fix the error. So the problem, you're on the right track, the problem's something else. Type or namespace could not be found. Are you missing a directive or a reference? So let's look up at the top of these two files. Look at line 7 in our controller. Look at line 6 in our model. Close. So they're both public. Our class is public, so it's not quite a scope issue. Why can our controller not see our model? Because our controllers are in the controller namespace. The models are in the model namespace. They're not aware of each other. So we have to add a reference in the controller to the model namespace. And so we can either do that manually or we can let Visual Studio do it for us. So if I just mouse over this and click my little show potential fixes, the first thing it says is add a using statement to the controller. So this controller has access to any of the models in the model namespace. So I'll just accept that, or I could manually type this code at the top of my file. So if I double click using the everything store models, it now adds a reference here. So my controllers are aware of my models. We're always going to need to do this because the controllers are almost always going to interact with the models for accessing our data. So now my error goes away and we can build. So now we're going to use a similar loop. In fact, we're going to use the same code, but rather than adding it to an array of strings, we're actually creating new product instances each time. So the loop structure will be the same, going from 1 to 10. But inside the loop now, rather than just adding, we're going to instantiate a new product object 10 times. So I don't even have to write a constructor, it's built in. So I'm going to create a new product option. Now we'll set the name property. We're going to create and then add. We're creating, now we're using objects. Creating a new object, we're setting the name property and adding it to the list. So when this loop is done, we'll have 10 product objects, not 10 product name strings. We're going to actually have objects. Now, in a few weeks, again, we're not really going to do this. We're not going to work with fake products we're creating. We're actually going to query the database and get a list of strongly typed product objects instead. We're just faking that for now. So now we don't want to use the view bag, but when we load the view, we also want to give it this list of products. So we're going to load the view, pass product list to it. So in our return statement, we can also pass the data. So not only are we loading the view called products, we're also passing it this list we've just created. So this is typically how we're going to send data from the controller to the view in the return statement. So we could send either a single product, like at this URL, or we could send a whole list. And now the controller job is done. So let's just make sure that compiles. We're good. So now we're going to want to rewrite our code in our view. Because first of all, the code we've already written, it's looking for data in the view bag. Well, there is nothing in the view bag anymore. We're also going to need to declare at the top of our view, we're going to need to tell the view, hey, when you get loaded, expect to get a list of products handed to you so that you can render it. We're going to go back to our view. And up here, we're going to set model property. That's with a capital M. It'll get a little confusing. We want to refer to, so what kind of object are we getting? What's this view going to expect? We have 6 tables in our database. Which table are we going to be working with? Yeah, it's going to expect to get a product. So, name of our project, our model's namespace. Oh, sorry. We'll use equal here, which is kind of odd. Oh, I don't think it likes it in this block. That'd be separate. Well, almost correct, except if we leave it this way, this means the view is expecting one product object, a single product. Instead, we want to tell it it's getting a list or a collection. And we're using a different .NET object for this. In the view is the IEnumerable. Oops. I don't think that's there. So expect a list of type product coming in. So now this code is going to get changed. If our model is a list of products, now we're handing a strongly typed object. So now if I type @key, sorry, this always confuses me. For some reason, I've never been able to understand. They want the declaration all in lowercase, model up there, yet when we refer to it in our code, it's a capital F. Sorry, I'll do this again. Now that I've set it up properly. So now, because we're passing in strongly typed objects, and I finally fixed my syntax, it now recognizes what a product object is, and it shows us the properties, including the name property. When we run this in the browser, you're not going to see any difference in the page. It's going to look exactly the same as it did when we used the view bag. But our page is more properly structured now because we're passing in strongly typed data. It will not accept anything other than a list of products. It'll get an error. So if I refresh it, it's going to look the same. Now, why the declaration at the top is all lowercase, and yet inside our loop we have to use a capital M, I couldn't tell you. It makes absolutely no sense to me. So when this loads, hopefully we shouldn't see any change at all. So we still have our same product list. We've just refactored it from using the view bag to using a strongly typed object. Okay, check your syntax carefully with mine. There may be a slight difference in your syntax. Right, yeah. So again, model up here in this declaration is all lowercase. But when we're referencing it here, it has a capital M. I don't understand. I can't explain that inconsistency. Okay, I'll come have a look at it in a minute. Okay, we're going to do one more thing, which is just going to take a second. I'm going to add a link to our product page in the navigation bar. We already have the layout file open. So we'll add one more link, and then I'm going to give you a lab to do. One more HTML action link called products, calls the product method of home controller. Oops, and that's products. You know what? I don't think we're going to do. Sorry? There will always be on GitHub. And it's going to be the same repository. Now, I'm not going to make new repositories because we're going to keep working in this same project. So I'll put it on Git in a minute. We're going to add the action link. So now if I refresh, I should have a link to my product page. Okay, we're actually not going to do lab 2 this week. We'll push it off till next week. So I'll change the due date. I'm going to modify it a little bit. So you got nothing for this week. Okay. We will have a lab likely for next week. Okay. So remember to be here on time next week. We'll have our quiz talking about view bag and models next week. as well as the same questions that were on the quiz for this week. Okay, so there'll be 20 questions in the pool and you get 5 of them. So come to class for 11, so you have 15 minutes to do your quiz. And then we'll resume with our everything store and get our database set up next week. Okay? All right, I will push the code to Git.